Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into the latest in the Diddy trial. We're looking at it through the analysis from the Two Angry Men podcast, their take on that TMZ episode, Bombshell evidence released. Our mission really is just to pull out the key legal insights, try to make sense of what's happening.
Exactly. We're taking their legal takes and trying to distill the strategies, the potential, hurdles, and maybe some things that weren't expected. Think of it like getting the inside scoop on how these lawyers are reading Cassie's testimony, that hotel video everyone's talking about, and some, frankly, pretty unusual legal angles.
Okay, yeah, let's dive right in with Cassie's testimony then. What immediately kind of grabbed me from the Two Angry Men discussion was how they saw her credibility. They felt, or at least discussed, that she came across as truthful, partly because she included stuff that wasn't, necessarily good for the prosecution's case.
Right. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? But sometimes admitting things that aren't flattering, like she did mentioning a swinger's lifestyle, jealousy, going back to Diddy repeatedly, it can make the core allegation seem more believable.
Yeah, exactly. It adds this weird layer of authenticity. Her lawyer, Doug Wigdor, basically said, the facts are the facts and the texts are the text. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note, her direct testimony and the cross-examination by the defense, that's all done now.
So they brought up this legal idea, two reasonable interpretations. Why is that so important here?
Oh, it's absolutely crucial. Basically, jurors are told if there are two reasonable ways to look at the evidence, one points to guilt, the other innocents don't have to pick the most likely one for innocence. Just a reasonable interpretation favoring innocence is enough. So the defense doesn't necessarily need to disprove everything outright.
They just need to plant a reasonable alternative explanation.
Exactly. Sow that seed of reasonable doubt. It highlights how, even with really damaging stuff, the defense's job is to offer another plausible story. That's the power of it.
Right. So it really makes you think about when jurors actually start making up their minds. One of the guys on Two Angry Men even floated the idea that it could happen really early, like maybe even during jury selection. What's your take?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Judges always tell jurors, wait till you've heard everything, keep an open mind. But, experienced lawyers often suspect those first impressions. Whether from jury selection or opening statements, they can be really, really sticky.
Like you start filtering everything else through that initial lens.
Kind of, yeah. People tend to process new information in a way that confirms what they already started to believe. It's human nature.
Which leads to how the trial's actually playing out, which seemed to surprise the Two Angry Men hosts a bit. They talked about moments where it felt like both sides kind of dropped the ball, didn't connect the dots fully. They called it failing to close the loop.
Yeah, I know what they meant. It's when a piece of evidence or a question comes up, but it's not explicitly tied back to the main argument, like those freak-off texts they discussed. Do you want to do a freak-off? I'm ovulating. Well, can we kiss? Yes.
Right.
The hosts were saying, okay, what actually happened in those 10-plus hours after that exchange? It's left hanging, ambiguous.
There's like a clue left on the table. And they mentioned another example, didn't they? About the prosecution initially.
Uh-huh. About not connecting an alleged threat Diddy made on a plane about releasing freak-off videos because of some alleged drug theft to a later request for a freak-off at dinner.
Ah, okay. So the link wasn't made clear immediately.
Not initially, according to their analysis. It potentially left room for the defense to argue that the later request was separate, maybe consensual, not directly tied to the earlier threat. Though, interestingly, they did note the prosecution tried to circle back and make that connection later on redirect. Maybe they realized the gap.
Fascinating. It really shows the strategic game playing out. They even compared it to cross-examination tactics, right? Where lawyers sometimes don't ask the obvious follow-up question.
Exactly. Sometimes you let the other side fail to clarify something, saving it for your closing argument. You point out their failure to connect the dots. It's a calculation. Do you ask now and risk making it worse, or hold back and hope the ambiguity helps you later? What you don't ask can be as strategic as what you do.
Okay, let's pivot to that Intercontinental Hotel video from 2016. The hosts really focused on that text Cassie sent after. You treated me like a rag doll. That plus the video. Wow, seems tough for the defense.
Absolutely. That's incredibly powerful evidence, the visual combined with her words. But then they pointed out there was another text soon after mentioning another freak-off.
Right, which brings up that really complex, sensitive idea of Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bonding.
Precisely. It complicates the narrative. We know the defense lawyer, Mark Anilo, had already called the video unforgivable and disgusting. So how do they handle it now?
Well, the podcast mentioned the defense's floating explanations like maybe bipolar disorder, maybe he blacked out.
Mm-hmm. They're introducing those possibilities.
And the reaction on Two Angry Men seemed pretty skeptical about that. Like, it could just sound like making excuses for something caught clearly on tape.
That's the risk, definitely. Jurors might see it as trying to minimize or excuse the behavior rather than explaining it. But as one of them rightly pointed out, the trial's not over. We haven't seen the full defense strategy unfold yet. It's important to remember, the judge handles the law, the jury handles the facts.
Okay, but something else came up regarding that incident, a huge settlement.
Yeah, that was a bit of a bombshell. Apparently, Cassie settled with the Intercontinental Hotel for $10 million related to that 2016 beating.
10 million, wow. So the podcast hosts were thinking the hotel might have been liable somehow.
That was the immediate speculation, yeah. Did they fail to step in? Should they have called the police? Basic security, duty of care to guests. A settlement that large suggests her lawyers felt they had a strong case against the hotel for negligence.
And didn't they mention some irony about the hotel's location?
Oh, yeah. Apparently, the old Intercontinental building is right across the street from the TMZ studio where they record Two Angry Men. Small world.
Huh. Okay. Now, the racketeering charge, this really got them talking. One host especially sounded really dubious about it applying here. Why?
Well, racketeering, or RICO, usually makes you think of, like, the mob, organized crime, right? It involves proving a pattern of criminal activity through an ongoing enterprise.
So not typically applied to this kind of situation.
It feels unusual, yeah. The idea of building a RICO case around things like arranging freakoffs, booking hotel rooms for them, it just doesn't fit the typical mold. It seems like a stretch compared to, say, mafia operations.
They compared it to the Mann Act, didn't they? Saying that might fit better.
They did. The Mann Act is specifically about transporting people across state lines for prostitution or, quote, immoral purposes. That seems, on the surface at least, more aligned with some of the specific allegations involving travel.
Okay.
They even mentioned a mock jury test someone ran on a similar scenario, where the mock jurors found the Mann Act charge way more believable than racketeering.
Interesting. Like transporting someone to Vegas, maybe for something exploitative, that fits the Mann Act more clearly.
Potentially, yes. If compensation and crossing state lines are involved for those purposes, it just seems like a more direct legal fit for some of the alleged actions.
It does bring up that tricky line, though, about government getting involved in people's private lives, right? Bedrooms, hotel rooms.
Absolutely. Where does investigating potential crimes stop and overreach into private, consensual, even if maybe unconventional sexual lives begin? That was the tension they discussed.
Which led them to that specific allegation about urinating in the mouth.
Right. Cassie's testimony mentioned an incident involving Diddy and a sex worker. Nancy Grace apparently reacted strongly, focusing on consent. But the Two Angry Men hosts pivoted slightly, emphasizing the general principle of respecting sexual privacy, referencing California's constitutional right to privacy.
So it's this clash. The fundamental right to privacy versus serious allegations that, if true and non-consensual, would definitely not be protected private acts.
Exactly. It's a core conflict in the case.
Yeah.
The allegations need investigation, but the principle of privacy is also vital. Finding the truth while respecting those boundaries is the challenge.
They also spent time on the media's role, using the Rodney King video as an analogy for how the hallway video is being perceived. What was the point there?
It was about desensitization and selective framing. Remember the Rodney King tape? The media often showed just the most brutal snippets repeatedly. But the defense in that trial used the whole video, including parts less shown, to argue King wasn't fully compliant, creating a different narrative for the jury.
So the worry is the Diddy hallway video gets played so much, just the shocking part, that people stop seeing nuance or context.
That's the danger, yeah. Constant repetition can dull the impact or prevent a deeper look. The analogy suggests we should be cautious, maybe slow down the video, look at the whole thing, consider surrounding events, just like the Rodney King defense did.
It's a good point about how media, even unintentionally, shapes perception by choosing what to emphasize. They mentioned the legal idea of split-second decisions for police.
Right. Contrasting that with forming intent for something like murder, which takes more than a split second, it highlights how interpreting video evidence is all about the narrative built around it. Their bottom line was, you have to show jurors the full picture to be credible. Don't just rely on the highlight reel.
So the huge question remains, that hallway video, is it just game over for the defense, too much to overcome, One of the hosts even said Diddy might not have been prosecuted at all without it.
It's a stark thought, right? Shows the power of video. It's undeniably a massive hurdle. The defense will try to contextualize it, argue it doesn't prove everything else, but yeah, it's tough. Jury selection or deselection, as one host joked, is key. Finding jurors who can truly put aside what they've seen and judge only the trial evidence.
That seems incredibly hard. Can people really just ignore something like that?
Psychologically, it's a huge ask, which is why, as they suggested, you can imagine the prosecutor's closing argument.
Yeah, how would that go?
Probably focusing heavily on that visual. You saw what he did in that hallway. Now, consider what Cassie says happened behind closed doors. Does that public display of aggression make the private allegations, the ones about control and lack of consent, seem more likely, connecting the public visual to the private claims?
Wow. Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into the two angry men take,
Yeah,
it certainly leaves you with a lot to chew on.
It really does. It makes you think about how we judge past events now, especially when private stuff becomes public legal drama. What's our responsibility as observers not to just jump to conclusions based on today's lens? And how much does something like that video warp our view of truth and what someone intended? It's complex and definitely not over yet.